If we consider the direction that policy is taking in the financing of later life in three key areas, pensions, social care and housing, and actually the jury's out on which direction the health service is going to go. If we look particularly across those three since the 1980s, we see a marked policy direction whereby politicians and the dominant political idea is that individuals must now finance their own life course. The state takes less and less of a role. We move from the concept of the idea that the state provides all your welfare in later life to the idea that we're now consumers who must buy our welfare in later life, and from the collectivist idea that the state will look after you to an individualistic idea that actually now we have to look after ourselves. And we see this in a number of ways. So, for example, in pensions, we have a fairly minimal state pension, even under the new reforms, and people have to make all the additional provision themselves. So the state supports that in various ways, but doesn't provide it. In social care, the recent reforms suggest that people are going to have to finance their own social care up to a limit of something like £70,000 or £75,000. Well, more than 80% of people will never reach that limit, so effectively they're having to finance their own social care. And in the housing arena, we, because of housing policies that have developed over the last 30 years, actually probably over the last 50 years or 60 years, people own their own homes, and they're now expected to find ways to release money from those properties in order to finance their later life. So we see as a result of this that financial products and the financial services industry are playing a greater and greater role in people's lives. In sociology, we call this the financialization of later life. So what do we mean by financialization? We're talking about the increasing role that money is playing in the personal lives of people across their life course. So if policymakers and policy is taking this direction, then it means that policymakers and government are imagining that their citizens, the people who they serve, are capable of making these financial decisions throughout their lives. So how do they do that? Well, in their language, they talk about people now having the freedom and choice to make those decisions. So instead of saying, we're making you make decisions that you're not competent to make, they present it as a liberating idea that we all now have been liberated from the state and we're able to fashion our own later lives. But it also means that people have to make the right decisions. And what are the right decisions at any point in time? You can only tell really whether you made the right financial decision with hindsight, sometimes 20 or 30 years later. So the government imagines us as being able to make the right financial decisions, and it imagines us as becoming competent human beings to manage all those complex financial decisions. There are two main consequences of this policy thread. The first is that the financial services sector really becomes a very important player in the policy making for late life welfare. So, for example, the government now doesn't consider reforms to pensions policy without the financial services sector having a really important seat at the government's table. And we've increasingly seen this over the last a decade or so in the social care sector as well. The financial services sector is right there influencing policy. One of the reasons that the cap on social care has been set so high is because incentives were, the financial services sector argued that they needed incentives to make it worthwhile for them to enter these markets. So that's the first thing, is that the financial services sector becomes an important player in government policy. But the second thing is that as people start to try and examine this question of financial capability, there is increasing concern that we can track back at least to the late 1990s. There's increasing concern among government, among the financial service sector, and among a whole host of other policy actors that actually we don't have this financial capability that they allege that we need in order to provide for our late life welfare. We just don't have it. And so you get increasingly hysterical pronouncements, really, coming out of government reports, coming out of investigations about the ignorance and the lack of capability and the lack of mathematical astuteness and so on of the average citizen. The idea that citizens should be financially responsible and save and provide for their own old age is actually quite an old idea, and it seems to emerge quite strongly with the birth of capitalism in the mid-19th century. We start immediately to see public pronouncements about how people should be fiscally prudent, and this idea of moral prudentialism, that you're a moral and worthy person if you sacrifice consumption in your current life in order to save for a rainy day or for later life. We see the emergence of friendly societies, which government encourages to say that people should club together and save and so on. So the concept that individuals have to save and provide for their own life is not a new idea, and it has a long tradition in capitalism. When we think about what's different between that concept and what I'm saying now about how financially capable the government expects people to be, one of the main differences that's emerged since the welfare state, so since the government decided that they were in the 1940s that they were going to be a state that provided for the welfare of its citizens from cradle to grave, through the health service and through a pension system and so on. The main difference is that increasingly late life welfare is becoming dependent on whether individuals are able to do this, whether they acquire money over the life course and what they do with that money, whether they're able to save it, whether they invested, whether they made the right housing choices, whether they can release money from their houses and so on. And so in order to do this, they need to navigate the new, very complex financial services sector. There are hundreds of players out there. They're all offering you different products. They're all offering you complex interest rates or complex saving rates with guarantees, without guarantees, tracking the stock market, not tracking the stock market. So people have to navigate this plethora of offers that are out there if they are going to do what the government wants them to do. Interestingly, far from seeing this new world order that the governments of various colour, because we've seen this through the Labour government of the 1990s, the early 2000s, and through the current Conservative Liberal Democrat alliance. So it's not necessarily a party political thing, but through all of this, what we in fact see is people saving very little. We've just had a report last week that suggests that private pension savings, so on top of the state pension, occupational and private pension, is at its lowest since 1953. We have rising levels of debt that are actually quite problematic and quite alarming. And it's proved very difficult and possibly even impossible for governments to regulate the financial services sector. So if we look at what's happened since the 1980s, 1990s, we've had a series of pension reselling scandals, we've had misuse of pension funds, we've had the whole mortgage endowment scandal where people were sold endowment policies that couldn't possibly pay off their mortgages. We have failures in the market, many market failures that we can think of in this sector. So, for example, in annuities, people will ask, why is the price of annuities so high? The market just isn't working. And we hear the same mantras about the market not working, about problems of regulation throughout these decades. The other thing that is really problematic is that there are tremendous gaps in information and knowledge between ordinary people and the financial services sector. So these information, what they call in economics information asymmetries, mean that the market struggles to function in any kind of efficient way. So it's not delivering us good value, it's not delivering us the lowest prices, it's not delivering us good investment returns, and actually all you have to do is ask anyone you know what's happening, and they'll be able to tell you that. So this is something that's very apparent to people. And so in this sector, what we generally see is, what we've seen historically over, let's say, the last 3 decades, is poor performance, poor governance, lack of transparency, and real difficulties in regulation. The government response, and as I say, through successive governments, has been to try to support the financial services sector. So effectively, they support this model. They haven't swayed from the model that if only we could get this all to work properly, people would be able to finance their own later lives. So they've tried numerous things to change the regulation, to work with the financial industry to develop new products, and so on. But the other thing that, of course, if this whole edifice is to work, if this whole vision of what society and what our late life can look like is to work, they also have to address this question that we are, as citizens, just not, as they would deem it, financially capable of navigating this course. So the two things absolutely go hand in glove. If you're going to say that the financial services sector is providing for our late life, you also have to say, oh, hang on a minute, people can't really navigate that world, so now we need a whole lot of policies to bring up the financial capability of the public. So commensurate with this growth in the financial services sector's provision of long-term financial welfare, you see a growth in policies for trying to improve the financial capability of the public, starting with the Financial Services Agency in the late 1990s when that was set up, which had a very clear public education mandate, and that's morphed through various provisions over the last 15 years. It's now changed into the Money Advice Service, which you might have seen the advertisements for. Little children in the backs of cars telling their parents how easy it is to make the right financial decision if only they contact the Money Advice Service. There is very little, and some people would say no evidence from anywhere in the world that financial education makes any difference to long-term financial outcomes. And when we start to examine what this debate is actually doing in society, so there are many people enrolled in delivering this agenda. There are NGOs, charities, advice centres, citizens' advice, the whole financial services industry. Everybody is trying to get the public up to this level of financial capability that would be sufficient to make the whole thing work. If you stop and you step back for a minute and you ask yourself, what questions are we not asking as a result of everybody being hooked on this idea? What is being silenced? What is not being questioned? And there are a number of things if you think about it that way. The first thing is, what is the level of financial capability that you want everybody to reach? What is it that you need them to know? So we have kind of very emotional pleas in policy reports saying the public don't understand this, they can't make the right decision, they can't choose interest rates, they can't distinguish between compound interest and simple interest. You kind of have to ask yourself, well, what if they could? You know, what if the public could do that? Is that going to be enough for them to make the right financial decision? What level of financial capability do we have to get everybody up to? What kind of decisions do we need them to be able to make? And how will we know that they've made those decisions correctly? If you get that far as I can tell, nobody's even attempted that. So the thing is that if you get that far, supposing we could evaluate this level of financial capability, you then need to ask the question, can you educate the public to that level? Is it actually possible? You know, go into a GCSE maths class, ask the maths teachers, what do you think you could do? And I think that's another question. We make a lot of assumptions about this. Even if you got to that point and you said, well, okay, let's say we've defined the exact financial capabilities that we need. We've worked out we can educate everybody in a way that they retain that knowledge and information the whole of their lives. They don't forget it when they leave school at 18, because some of these decisions they'll be having to make when they're 67. Ask yourself how much of your high school maths you remember. But let's say we get over all those hurdles. You have to ask a very big question, which is, what difference would it make? And nobody ever evaluates that question. So if we step back from this whole agenda of how you should manage your money, what you should do with it, where you should put it, and ask ourselves, what causes poverty in later life? So different arena of research. Well, actually, we know quite a lot about what causes poverty in later life. There's a body of research going back decades on this question. And we know that structural issues in society are hugely influential in whether you are poor in later life. So, your employment record. Did you live through a recession? Are you a woman? Did you have children? Did you take career breaks? If you worked for a car factory in Southampton or a car factory in Newcastle, did those factories offer you any pension? If they did, what was the pension? Are you part of the government's contracted out service that didn't get enrolled in government pensions when they hived off a lot of their activity? You know, the questions about what causes poverty are these big structural issues around, are you a low earner? Are your earnings so low that you couldn't possibly save? Do you have debt? You might have a higher level of earnings, but you might have accumulated debt. Interest rates were very high. Credit companies don't always behave very well. And these are the issues that lead people into difficulties in later life. The extent to which, if somebody who had money to invest, invested in this product or that product, what difference would that make? And that's a question that is entirely silenced by this focus on how financially capable we need to make our citizens. We never get to ask that question. So if you follow on to the next step, what gets silenced behind that is any discussion of whether the state should be providing more collective, less individualistic solutions to late life welfare. We never get anywhere near discussing that, because in order to discuss that, we'd have had to have passed all these other barriers that are no longer part of our public discussion. Our public discussion has become, the public is stupid, they don't know how to make financial markets work, they don't know how to make finances work for themselves, they don't understand financial markets, they really just aren't very bright. If we educate them, then we can sell them the right products and then everything will be all right. And so we never get anywhere near asking ourselves, should we go to a better tax-funded pension system? Should we go to a universal social care system funded through taxation? We can't get anywhere near that discussion because it's barricaded by all of these public pronouncements about finances. Let's look around us at the moment. In 2008, we had a global financial crisis. And that financial crisis has plunged the world into recession, unemployment, we have zero interest rates, capital markets collapsed. Well, those things have affected people very, very badly. When we did some of the research that we did a couple of years ago, looking at how older couples manage their money, was actually the field work was taking place in 2008, 2009. And older people who were dependent on very modest savings for their welfare in late life, suddenly found that those modest savings had zero interest rates and they were having to draw down the capital, and they were very, very anxious about all of that. Now, what did that have to do with them? They don't control interest rates. They don't control the global economic macro structure. What should they have done with their money? They had absolutely no choice in the matter. And if you think about it, there wasn't, as far as I can tell, there wasn't a financial services sector person in the world with all of their financial capability and financial acumen and financial this and financial that who foresaw that global economic crisis. So what is an individual person to do? So what are the effects of that? There are two main consequences, I think. One is that it enables government to blame the citizen when they don't have sufficient money in later life. So instead of saying, I know we went through a double dip recession or a triple dip recession and you spent 12 years out of the employment and that had a marked effect on what happened to you after that. And actually, is that government's fault? Instead of being able to say that, they say, well, it's your fault. You didn't save. Or instead of saying you were born into a poor family and you were never able to be socially mobile because the school you went to was pretty dreadful, and you didn't have any mentors to help you get on or get to university or something like that. Instead of looking at those structural issues that are reducing social mobility in life, they say, well, it's your fault. Or instead of looking at a woman who struggles to balance work and family life, who has 2 or 3 children that she's trying to take care of, who need her, need parents to support them. There aren't really jobs that will pay enough to pay for childcare and so on. And so for 15 years, her employment is part-time and off and on. Instead of looking at that and saying, well, we didn't provide the infrastructure that would enable you to have earned enough money, spent enough time with your children and saved, they say, well, it's your fault. You didn't save. So it enables the discourse of government and the financial services sector to blame individuals, when actually individuals don't have, they have a lot of structural and societal barriers to saving. And the second thing it does is, if you think about it, it's a kind of impeccable strategy. Because if someone in government says to you, well, we need to have this program to make people more financially capable, how can you argue with that? It's such a sensible thing to say. So by doing that, they've enabled hosts of people, and academics and providers and the commercial sector and the charity sector. Everybody has to say, yes, of course, that's a good agenda, we need to support it. And therein lies the tale, because that's how we stop oppositional ideas from being discussed publicly in the country. The other thing that I think we really need to think about is, does this mean that we're going to witness new kinds of inequality in later life, which are inequalities between people who have better managed to navigate this new financial landscape and people who haven't. And that could be because of their own resources, or because some people are more connected, they have better social resources, they're more embedded in resources. So, we used to only think of inequality in terms of social class or occupation, your gender, ethnicity, and those sorts of cleavages in society. But I think we are witnessing, and we will in the future witness to an even greater extent, differences between people who do better out of this sometimes random financial environment and people who do worse or can't find their way through it. It also means that we have to think quite hard, and I think as sociologists we don't think about this nearly enough, about the role of inheritance. Because increasingly people will be depending on inheritance for their own late life welfare. So they'll be depending on inheritance perhaps in their 60s and 70s from a parent in their 80s, 90s, or a centenarian, in order to have a reasonable amount of money in late life. And that introduces a huge element of inequality, because the richer the family, the more likely they are to pass that inheritance on down through the generations. But it also introduces a real scale of randomness to the whole thing. Although about 80% of people over 65 now own their own home without mortgage, a lot of those homes are actually very modest. There are not the huge amounts of equity that we see in London and the South East. And for one family where the older generation who own that home perhaps live a long, healthy life and don't need to spend a lot of that money on care, there will be something to pass on to the next generation. Another entirely equivalent family, exactly the same circumstances, perhaps next door, if some fairly random element of ill health strikes that family in late life, perhaps one of a couple or both of a couple, there will possibly be nothing left to pass to the next generation. And so these new inequalities are emerging, and we are creating them with this system of financing late life welfare.